Brazil is South America's USA, and I don't just say that because of their similar populations, cultural influences, or the fact that they had fairly right-leaning leaders that eventually ended up in Florida. Seriously, he was eating KFC there, and I'd have to say, the fact that he's eating just the skin off the bone is something I totally agree with. This is a politician that represents me when it comes to how they eat their KFC, but it is also, something which is obviously a federation made up of lots of smaller states with a capital that is not the largest city, something that is already a global minority, but it's even more interesting because of that federation making them have a capital that was created from scratch. Brasilia in Brazil and Washington DC in the United States. The similarities between these countries do keep rolling, and today I want to talk about Brazil and some of the weird oddities, because when you look at it on a map and you see its shape, you might miss a lot of the finer details about how it ended up that way. Because here's the deal with the US, every single time you look at it on a map, at least every single time I look at it, it looks like they were going for 50 states, right? And they were working out really nice even borders on the west here, and then as soon as they got close to the east, they're like, oh god, we still have 20 to go, and they just kind of rushed them in there in small little spaces where they could fit them, and that's why the east coast of the US is so much messier and smaller than the west coast. However, the actual reality is having big square borders is a sign that you didn't really know the territory that you were building on before. This is basically the situation that happened in Brazil, but instead of big square borders, they instead have mostly curved lines with a few straight lines between them, and the only reason that that's true is because they did know there were rivers back here. Instead of building to the continent's edge, which the United States got lucky and /or fought some wars to be able to do, Brazil, on the other hand, basically built out midway into the continent, and their borders are almost always rivers. This defines their borders with other countries, as you can see if you look really closely right here, but when they're not using rivers as their borders, they generally didn't know what the land looked like, so it'll be just a straight line in many places that hits a not quite right angle in other places, and this is what defines their borders, not just with other countries, but in internal state borders this is true too. If you look at the state of Amazonas, which is of course famous because, you know, that big tech company is from there, trust me, that's true, don't look it up. But because of this, you can see that this famous state right here actually does have quite a few curvy borders following some rivers. There's a famous river in the Amazon forest, but I don't know what the river's called. Do you know? Could you let me know in the comments down below? In the Amazon forest, there's a river. What is that river called? Anyway, so in the you can see they use a lot of these rivers as boundaries, but then also even the Amazonas state itself has these super straight lines. In fact, Brazil as itself was founded on one of these very straight lines, and let me show you, because the whole world, if you don't know, was split into two by the Pope in 1518, I want to say, or 1498. You know, there was the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is definitely how you pronounce that, and basically the Pope said, okay, to avoid war between the two biggest colonial powers of the time, I know, the UK hadn't gotten in on the game yet, we didn't realize it was a big deal, but the two biggest powers at the time were Spain and Portugal, so they split the world in two. Everything to the east of this line and the west of this line was Portugal's, and everything to the west of it and the east of it was Spain's. And this is why when you look at the very origin of Brazil, you can see that it's got this very straight line border right here, because that matches the straight line the Pope said they had to follow. There's a really interesting thing. You know, actually, can I just evaluate this map for a second? Can we just take 1 second? By the way, do you like my new big screen me mode here? Can I just take a second to say that Portugal really got screwed on this one? If you were doing this today, and we're obviously going to evaluate this from a modern perspective, getting Africa, some of Brazil, half of Greenland, Iceland, really they got Iceland, as well as like, Western Australia, the second best Australia, and Indonesia, that is a raw deal in exchange for losing all of the Americas outside of that little bit of Brazil, losing some of Antarctica, and even losing what is now just Russia, actually. I was going to say Russian America, but that's just Russia right there. Losing all of these territories and getting just Africa did not work out for them. I mean, how are those Portuguese African colonies coming along now? Did they join the Commonwealth? Have they lost their point? So the only major Portuguese colony that is in serious working condition is Brazil, but how did they, first of all, why did they sign a bad deal? Because we didn't know the world looked like this. They didn't know they were giving up some real sweet deals east and west of that. But the other reason, and honestly, if they had colonized it and gotten it, maybe it would have been different. But the other more important factor is that eventually this line stopped existing. It says 1494 here, so there we go. Now we know. The Linea de Tordesillas. So the interesting thing about this line is it stopped existing. If we go back to the map, you can actually see the way it was founded is very much like the US, where it's lots of vertical colonies, and then it splits into two, and then it goes like crazy. But how does that happen? Wait, what happened there? Can we go back a second? How does it go from this to this? Everyone understands that. How does the line stop existing? Well, between these two dates, something interesting happened. Spain and Portugal joined under a single crown. down. One of the crazy things about European countries that maybe just is, if you live in a presidential republic where you elect your leader, and if you live in, this is not what I was intending to show you, but here are British words, not in the United States. But if you live in a country where you elect a president and he's your figurehead, and you got to decide between the guy from the Brazil above everything, God above everyone party, or the make people happy again party, first of all, yeah, it's a real hard choice. Do you want people to be happy, or do you want Brazil to be above everything? They're both pretty good things. If you live in a country where your highest figure is a president, you might not understand that, in Europe, not only do we have monarchies now, but also the way things were just run is there's a guy and he's in charge. And because those royal families were pretty similar across Europe, if your guy died, so the Portuguese king just went off into battle somewhere in Morocco and then wasn't found again, and so then the Spanish ruler at the time became the Portuguese ruler. And then what was the point in having this silly map between you and you? They removed the map and they could expand Brazil, which is why it stopped looking like this and then started looking like this. But then, importantly, after the two crowns became one, why they could expand more inland. And if you look at the territorial evolution beyond that, you can see that it's very much, again, similar story to the USA. To tie this back into my main point, their parties have much more fun names. But if you look at the USA, you can see, if you look at the two countries, you can see it's very much the same, just with a slightly sooner west point. If Brazil had reached all the way across the continent, there is no doubt that their population would be a match for the United States right now, maybe even their cultural influence. The only reason they couldn't is because of those damn Spanish-speaking countries. Seriously, have you ever looked at, South America and just questioned, wow, it's further east than you think, right? I mean, Brazil's split into 3 time zones too, but it's interesting that it's 3, 4, 5 as opposed to, I think it's 5, 6, 7, 8 for America. But the other interesting thing, by the way, when I say America, I'm referring to the United States of America, of course. But the other interesting thing about it is the way that is it this one? This is a fun graph right here. The other interesting thing about Brazil has to be the fact that it is divided in many. It's divided politically, of course, in the same way. But also, it's very interesting that you can see the exact same thing plays out here, where they've got this west versus east influence. They've got some places that are very heavily in favor of one party, and some places that are opposite. In this case, it went east-west, and it ended up that West won with the just for more fun in Brazilian politics, by the way. This video isn't all about Brazil politics. It's usually about geopolitics, but I guess we have to talk about the internal politics of the country and mention just the weird fact that this guy is often referred to as far right, but even the biggest support would say he's pretty right wing, right? He's on the right of the country, but his party is called the Social Liberal Party because he took over a small left-leaning party so he could just have it as his own. And so the Social Liberal Party is actually a far right political party, according to Wikipedia, which is just, Brazil. It's fun. They got some interesting electoral politics. But yeah, the reason it broke in the end is because some of those western states switched over, as well as some of the east ones. There is this fun east-west split, which honestly is, you might think wow, that's weird that they split geographically. It's surprising the United States does not. When you see Brazil having such different interests for people living in Amazonas or living, in the inland states versus people living on the coast. If you live in Salvador or you live in Rio de Janeiro, which is often mistaken for the capital, rightly so, by the way. It used to be the capital for a while, and it's the biggest city. And as this map clearly states, the biggest city is usually the capital, but we'll leave that to the side for now. But if you live in Rio de Janeiro, your politics and your priorities are going to be so, can you imagine you live right here? Your priorities have to be different. Look at this, by the way. Now imagine this and put this in direct contrast to a picture I'm sure we won't even get. Because if you live all the way out over in the state of, I'm just going to pick a random point here. Just make sure it's rural. If you live here, then your priorities are different. Yeah, honestly, this looks not as different as I was imagining, right? They've got 4 cars. They're living large out here. Louvrias Dias's, at least. Anyway, so my point with this video, to keep things on track, is Brazil has a similar history and a similar kind of expansionist attitude that just happened to run across other countries that were in the way. And so but despite this, it is still the largest country in South America by a decent while too. If it weren't for all those Spanish-speaking countries getting in the way, damn Spain ruining everything again, I think Portugal could have had some hegemony, or I guess Brazil nowadays would have had some cultural hegemony over this entire place. Seriously, if Spain had even come together and done the reverse and taken over Brazil, we could have seen something similar. similar, but just the perfect divide between these two spheres of influence led to the mess that is South America today. I think, but if you look at, if you look at Brazil, they are known as a part of BRIC, right? BRIC, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The fact that Brazil is on par with Russia, a former superpower, on par with India, who, just fun fact, I don't know if you've heard about this, they've got the highest population in the world. The fact that just, oh yeah, there's one of this country that started existing a few hundred years ago is matching that is absolutely wild, and that is why I love to see this crazy evolution of their territory. It did stop a little bit short of where they probably could have ended up, and the reasons for that are totally the wars they ran into and all the other stuff like that. But Brazil has been, by and large, a pretty successful country despite all those metrics. Here is a crazy, I want to give some praise to Brazil where praise is due. Brazil has the exact same thing as the US, where they have a huge history of wars, and if you look through these, green are victories and blue are, there's something else, like not necessarily a loss, a compromise, a regime change. There is one loss in this entire thing, and it's to the Kingdom of England, and hate to say it, but we're unbeaten. That doesn't even count as a loss. Everyone, we're not actually unbeaten at all. Don't fact check that, please. But if you don't fact check it, then the Kingdom of England is unbeaten, and so it's not even really losing, right? That's that. Also, wow, it's old if it's the Kingdom of England rather than Great Britain. But anyway, point being here is having all these wins. If you look into these wins, by the way, you see some pretty big ones. Kingdom of France, 1555 to 1736. Wow, that's pretty good. If you look into this, you'll find. What's that? Is that the Spanish Empire and France? Pretty good. What's that? Did Portugal beat France again? Yes, they did. Wow, that's pretty good. What's that? Was there another war with France? Nah, they weren't stupid enough to have another war. I'm just kidding. Of course there was another war with France, and they won it again. And then what about this time where technically, Brazil was on the same side as all these guys? Well, that doesn't really count. But what about the other time that Brazil invaded France? The Lobster War. So it's not really a war, I have to admit, but I have to tell you about this one because I cannot believe this is a real thing. There was a dispute between Brazil and France. France being obviously French Guiana, which is just France, but it has to be labeled different because you wouldn't expect this to be France if this was just cool. Whatever. So French Guiana and Brazil had a dispute over lobsters, which is just. Already funny. It's like Cod War's level of humor. But the whole dispute was that, Brazil refused to allow fishing vessels to catch spiny lobsters because they argued that lobsters crawl along the continental shelf, whereas France maintained that lobsters swim. They had a whole war over whether lobsters crawled on the shelf or swam in the water, because that genuinely changes whether it's territorial waters or not. And you can see this is a real thing that happened in the Lobster War. And I just, I have to say, absolutely hilarious. Any country that beats France that many times in a war has my personal respect. And yeah, I do have to say, Brazil's absolute wrecking as far as World War. Obviously there's not many huge, massive, world-ending wars in there, but Brazil has an incredibly successful military history, and the only thing that holds them back as a world power is the fact that they are middle income. The fact that they are part of BRIC, B-R-I-C, means they are by definition a middle income emerging economy. They could be the next world superpower, and there's a lot of very interesting things that point to it always being just around the corner, but that is the only key difference between this and the United States. If Brazil had been just a bit larger, been in just the right place at just the right time, we would probably live in a world that was not unipolar around the US and whatever they feel like going as being the world's rules. Instead, we live in a world where Brazil would have just as much of an influence. And I think, I do wonder like how the world would have been vastly different as a result of that. But I also wonder, I think I brought up this map earlier, I have to mention Brazil also has the similarity of being immigrant-based as a country, but they are very different to the US. So this is from 2000, it's a few years old, but even back then, 10% of immigrants to Brazil are from Japan. Isn't that insane? Isn't that, whatever, nuts fact. Anyway, I couldn't tie it into this video in any other way, but I do want to say that this is the basic difference between Brazil and the US. They have so much in common. They have so much of what makes their countries similar in terms of starting in the east, expanding out to the west until they hit whatever their wall was. And the only difference is they happen to hit their wall just a little bit sooner. And this is your basic reminder, if you're gonna start a continent-sized country, always make sure you hit the other coast. That's the goal, that's the vision. And if you're gonna do this again, if you're trying to, it worked for Australia, it worked for the US, it just about worked in the end there for Canada. And if we can all come together, start a GoFundMe to eliminate Peru from the map, maybe we can get this going for Brazil too. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I don't know if it's okay to advocate for the lack of existence of Peru in a video. Will that get me demonetized? I'm not sure. What I really care about though is saying thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. And actually I don't hope you enjoyed. This is a terrible quality video of just me talking over my camera. I hope you had a bad time, and that because if you didn't, it reflects poorly on you as a person. Thank you for watching. Second channel. Don't care. Bye.